by engaging in long-term development, building resilience, responding to emergency situations, and seeking to address the root causes of poverty around the world. We work in about 26 countries, ranging from Haiti to Bangladesh. And part of Concern's recent work in Ireland is that there's been a campaigns team was created. We and the campaigns team look specifically on climate change, on the SDGs, and issues around hunger and conflict. So over the next couple of months, we're going to have loads of different actions and options for people to engage in. We have a few more webinars. We have in-person sessions in our Dublin office, and there'll be a few petitions and other campaigns. And you can get more information about these by following us on Instagram or on X, and the handle is @ConcernActive. I'm now going to pass you over to my colleague Aine Gourley, who is the Project Us Campaigns Officer.
Thank you, Laura, and welcome everyone to the first episode or webinar of the series for EU and Me. To give you some background about Project Us, it is Concern's a worldwide SDG campaign which started back in 2018, so about 6 years ago, where we have helped facilitate hundreds of design thinking workshops and world cafes to help people connect to the global goals. The project's aim is to build awareness of the UN SDGs and how the global goals connect to local issues. To make the SDGs an achievable target by 2030, it's understanding they're not a you issue, they're an us issue. So with 6 years left until we reach Agenda 2030, our goal is to re-energise the movement for change, to champion the global goals, become informed, active citizens, with reaching the furthest behind whatever it takes. We welcome you all to join our community. Please follow our social media sites. If you go to the Project Us website, you can book in a session for a workshop with myself, and you're welcome to attend our already scheduled workshops. So tomorrow we're in ATU Mayo, the following Wednesday we're down in Carlow College, and the week after that then we're in TU Dublin. You can drop me an email as well if you have any questions to ainedaily@concern.net. I hope you enjoyed the session today and the rest of the series. And not to forget as well to check the register to have your vote, to get your vote. Once the referendums are over on the 8th of March, the electoral will open again. So without further ado, I'd like to pass you over to our guest, Deputy CEO of the European Movement Ireland, Lorna Hayes. Lorna, the screen is yours.
Hi everyone, and thanks very much to Concern colleagues for that great introduction and overview. My name is Lorna Hayes, Deputy CEO at European Movement Ireland, and I'm joined here with my colleague Aine Gourley, who's our Research and Policy Officer. I'll quickly, just before we get into it, we'll both be co-presenting, and really happy that you're all joining us today, and feel free to ask any questions throughout or at the end. And just before we get into it, I just want to frame it a bit. Two things to think about as we go through, like why is the EU relevant to you? We can think about this both from our individual perspectives, how the European Union obviously impacts our day-to-day lives. We're going to go through that now in quite some detail, but also I think it might be useful to frame it in relation to Concern's work on international development and humanitarian issues. The EU obviously legislates and regulates policies at EU level, which impacts member states, but also has a very active role with third countries, bilateral relations through its EU delegations in different countries, through human rights dialogue, and so on. So it's important to think about, I suppose, the EU both from its kind of internal action within the region or the bloc, but also externally. Okay, so I'm just going to start, and hopefully you're going to find this interesting. So quickly, an introduction to European Movement Ireland. And then we'll talk a bit, or Aine, my colleague, will talk a bit about EU institutions. Then we're going to go through kind of the key point of today's presentation is really why are the European parliamentary elections important? And then how does the European Union affect us at national level? So European Movement Ireland actually predates Ireland's membership of the European Union. We were founded in 1954, and just last month in January, we celebrated our 70th anniversary. And we actually played a key role in Ireland joining the EU and encouraging people to vote. And at the time, 83% of the Irish population voted in favour of Ireland joining. And key areas of work for European Movement Ireland are advocacy, engagement, communications, and all in relation to EU affairs and Ireland's role in the EU. So now I'm going to hand over to Aine, and she will introduce some aspects of European institutions.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Is there an echo? Everything's good. So nice to have everyone here. So I just wanted to start off with a question, what is the European Union? Because I don't want to overestimate anyone's knowledge or underestimate it either. To start, so the EU is essentially a political and economic union. It's made up of 27 member states. Ireland joined in 1973, and the EU as we know it today has its roots in treaties that were signed after the Second World War, basically to foster economic cooperation and have countries more economically independent so that they would be more likely to avoid conflict. So the original European Economic Community was created in 1958. There are about 450 million EU citizens, and they share a single market, a common currency, the euro, as well as guaranteed rights, common history, and with 27 member states comes a continent with very diverse cultures and languages. So the EU's motto is United in Diversity. So the institutional setup is very unique. It's sprawling, it's quite complex, and the decision-making system is changing all the time. There are currently 7 European institutions, 7 EU bodies, and over 30 decentralized agencies spread across the EU. You might have heard of the news about AMLA, the Anti-Money Laundering Authority. That was the location was announced during the week, and so that would be a decentralized agency. But today we're going to talk about the institutions, and talk about how they interact with each other, try and simplify a little bit. So there's essentially the executive power and the legislative power. With the executive power comes the European Council and the Commission. And then we have on the other side the legislative power of the Council of the EU and the European Parliament. And then above that we have the European Court of Justice, which is the institution that interprets EU law and makes sure that it's applied in the same way in all countries. It settles kind of legal disputes between national governments and EU institutions, and also in some circumstances the court can be used by individuals as well. So move on to the Commission first, which a lot of people will most likely be familiar with. It's the main executive arm of the EU. It has a complete monopoly on legislative initiative, and there's one commissioner per member state. Our commissioner is Mairead McGuinness, of course, who heads up the DG for Financial Stability, Capital Markets Union, and the Commission essentially oversees the application of EU law, the enforcement, and it has a 5-year mandate. So the mandate will run out shortly after the European Parliament elections in June. So we'll see a new Commission around the end of October, the start of November. And then moving on to the European Council and the Council of the European Union, that's quite confusing. Have a little office meme here because a lot of people with the complication of the name don't understand the difference. Even people who study the EU still can't tell the difference. And journalists are particularly prone to mix up the European Council with the Council of the European Union. There's also a non-EU organization called the Council of Europe, which is based in Strasbourg. That's not to be confused with the European Council and the Council. It's an organization that's an international organization and protects human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. But the EU institutions are the European Council and the Council of the European Union. The European Council is the body of leaders, so that's where you'll see Charles Michel, who's there, and the heads of state or government. So we would have Leo Varadkar and other heads of state from the EU heading to the Council in Brussels to meet on various high-level issues. And so their role is mainly defining the EU's general political direction and priorities. They also have an agenda-setting role, like the Commission. However, they don't adopt legislation. That's done by the Parliament and the Council of the European Union. So right now, as I said, it's Charles Michel, who's the president, who's an ex-Belgian prime minister. He was recently surrounded with a bit of controversy, people might have seen, because he said that he was going to step down from his presidency role and running in the European elections as an MEP. He has since reversed that decision because of the backlash and will indeed finish his mandate, which will end at the end of November. So currently the council with the head of states also said to lack a bit of accountability because they do have an increased role in EU policy making. So we kind of see this movement to hold the council a little bit more to account. There are regular plenary debates with the president of the council, and yeah, we see a bit more that the president of the parliament is involved in the European Council meetings. And then on the other side, the Council of the European Union, that's the co-legislator with the parliament. So we're quite interested in this institution today. So it's composed of national ministers from each EU country, and it's a legislative power. It works closely with the parliament in trilogues, and it's chaired by a member state for 6 months. So at the moment, it's Belgium. Previously, it was Spain, and then next it will be Hungary, which is very exciting because that will be Viktor Orban, who will be at the helm at the time. And Ireland will also chair in July 2026. So the council is composed of national ministers and they coordinate policies in specific fields. So we'll have groups on economic policy, fiscal policy, agricultural policy, environmental policy, etc. And it's organized in 10 policy configurations in total. So they negotiate, they adopt EU legislation during trilogues, and they also importantly adopt the budget with the European Parliament. So now I'll pass back over to Lorna. She'll talk more about the European Parliament.
Thanks, Anya. So yeah, first we'll take a look at the European Parliament. What do members of the European Parliament do, and how does the European Parliament work? So we were going to ask if anyone knows any of the names of any of our current MEPs. I'm not sure if we have the chat function. I don't think we can see it, but if anyone from Concern wants to see if any names are being shared. Anya, you're on mute.
Yep, the chat function is working, and we have a...
Oh yeah, that's great. I see Barry Andrews. I see a few names being shared. Fantastic. So let's see. Yes, Barry Andrews was our first. So we've Barry Andrews from Fianna Fáil, we've Deirdre Clune from Fine Gael, Kieran Cuff from the Green Party, Claire Daly, who's an independent, Francis Fitzgerald, Fine Gael, Luke Ming Flanagan, independent, Billy Kelleher, Fianna Fáil, Sean Kelly, Fine Gael, Maria Walsh, Fine Gael, Chris McManus, Sinn Féin, Colin Markey, Fine Gael, Grace O'Sullivan, Green Party, and Mick Wallace, independent. So these are our current, but as we know, elections are coming up in June, so it remains to be seen who will run again, and then obviously the outcome of the elections. So what is the European Parliament? Essentially, since the 1950s, the Parliament was a consultative, or in the 1950s, the Parliament was a consultative body with symbolic functions, but with no real influence in policy-making processes. However, under the Lisbon Treaty, and this has been in effect since 2009, its powers have significantly increased. And what's particularly interesting about the European Parliament is it's the world's only directly elected transnational assembly and the only EU body that is elected by the people. So every 5 years, we have the option to, or voters can choose from around 700 members or MEPs. And these MEPs are representing approximately 450 million Europeans. Currently, we have around 705 MEPs sitting in the European Parliament, but prior to Brexit, there were around 751 MEPs, including the President, and this is the maximum that the EU law allows for. Then the allocation of seats is broken down according to the principle of proportionality, which essentially means or gives weighting according to the member state's population size. So for example, the Germans have 96 MEPs, but the Maltese only have 6. And essentially the European Parliament debates, amends and passes European legislation on behalf of EU citizens and regarding issues that are central to our daily lives. So it really does play a key role within the broader EU architecture. As well as being a legislative power, the European Parliament also plays a supervisory role. So by this we mean it defends key values or principles, freedom, equality, and the rule of law across the EU, and it promotes democracy and human rights around the world through election observations, human rights dialogues, overseas aid, etc. And it also has a key job or role of electing the president of the European Commission, which I think the new president should be incoming, I think in October of this year. And it has budgetary powers, which means it can also decide how the EU funding or budget is spent. And it signs off on the EU budget along with the Council. Another interesting fact about the Parliament is that there are 24 official languages. And since 2022, Irish is also considered a full status language, or has full status language within the European Parliament. So where is the European Parliament? The official seat is actually located in Strasbourg, where the main plenary sessions take place once a month. But since the Parliament's work involves closely monitoring and interacting with the European Council and the European Commission, both of which are based in Brussels, over time, MPs have decided to organise more of their work in Brussels because it just is more effective. And now we're going to look a bit at the political groupings in Parliament. So in theory, you might expect that the Parliament would be completely chaotic, but actually it's not that chaotic. And that's due to three vital structures, which are the political groupings that we're going to talk about, parliamentary committees, and some of the hierarchical organisations, such as the Secretary General of the Parliament. So what's interesting about the Parliament is the political groupings and that MEPs coalesce or form alliances across political lines. So they're not organised by nationality. And it's been like this since 1953. And it's very important to recognise that an important amount of funding goes through these political groups. So they are like key actors within the broader system. And the political groups are also the main actors when it comes to activities, for example, for motions and tabling amendments. To form a political group, there must be at least 23 members representing at least 1/4 of the member states. And there are currently 7 political groups within the European Parliament. So you can see them here in the current divisions, but now we're just going to talk about them or look at them in a bit more detail. So the largest political grouping is the European People's Party. This has Christian democratic roots. It's centre-right, 179 MEPs, and there are several, you can see Irish MEPs affiliated with this grouping. And the Irish political party that's also affiliated is Fine Gael. Then we have the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. This is the second largest political grouping, centre-left, 141 MEPs, and currently no Irish MEPs are part of this group, but the Labour Party and Social Democrats are affiliated. Then we've Renew Europe, third largest group, centrist, but with both right and left factions. It has liberal, pro-European kind of foundations. 100 MEPs are part of this group, and Irish MPs Barry Andrews and Billy Kelleher are also part of this group. And the political party that's affiliated is Fianna Fáil. Then the Greens, they are a progressive alliance with 71 MEPs. Obviously, their key focus is climate and environmental protection, and also there are some Irish MPs affiliated with this group. And the Green Party, of course. Then we have the European Conservatives and Reformist groups. So these will be considered right-wing, but with both centre and far-right factions. They have 67 MEPs, and currently there's no Irish MEPs affiliated. Then the next grouping is the Identity and Democracy group. So this is a right-wing to a far-right political group. It has 58 MEPs currently, and no Irish MEPs affiliated at the moment. And then I think this is the last political grouping is the left, the smallest, 38 MEPs. But each component of this group retains its own identity and policies, and there are several Irish MEPs affiliated, I think mostly the independents. So then we can look a bit at the landscape of the European Parliament, and something that's very interesting to note is that it has actually been quite stable since the very first direct elections. However, the political landscape is today becoming more fragmented than it was during the 70s up until around the 90s. And everyone, well, most people or observers would predict that this fragmentation is only set to intensify, especially if parties or political groupings on the right, such as the ID, win more seats in June. Then we can take a look at the coalitions. So there's different coalitions or groupings, and these tend to kind of align themselves depending on socioeconomic interests. And in the last 2 decades, there's been more division between the left and the right. And while a far-right majority in the Parliament is unlikely, their increased presence could profoundly impact EU politics and policy making going forward, so post the June elections. And issues like migration, climate change, and EU integration could become more contentious. And if the far right does gain more seats, voting coalitions may also change significantly, and we may see a tactical shift further right by centre-right groups in an effort to respond to growing public discontent on a range of sensitive topics. And then if we look, it's also interesting to look at the projected makeup of the European Parliament post-June elections. Polls have suggested that the far-right party is set to become the 3rd largest political group in the European Parliament. And some polls also put the the other far-right party, is running 4th in the polls. Due to this expected political shift, there will be a growing need for parties such as the EPP, which includes Fine Gael, and the SNDs to collaborate to combat the far right. The European Parliament has, though, done a lot to try and kind of avoid national cleavages entering the debates at European level. And the internal rules of the Parliament only refer to groups, committees, and interparliamentary delegations, and they don't refer to national delegations. However, again, we do tend to see that extreme right MEPs tend to express themselves in the Parliament along kind of their national lines or their national interests. So it is a shift that has been noticed in recent years. And then we can see that the Parliament is structured around committees. So there's a whole range of committees. These committees meet in Brussels. Their debates are held in public and in principle web streamed. The committees mirror the political landscape of the entire Parliament, as in the weight of each political group should be respected in the committees. And this is essentially a kind of second space or structure where MEPs can discuss and debate outside of their political groups, and also where they engage in the legislative process. So we'll look a bit more now at the elections. So the elections in the European Union are taking place in a kind of context of a broader, very busy election year globally. In 2024, we have 3.2 billion people will be heading to the polls worldwide. Some new newspapers have called it the democracy Super Bowl. And a few things to note really in this busy election year. It's no longer an impossibility that Donald Trump could return to the White House. In Europe, there's different shifts happening as well. In Hungary, Hungary will take the presidency of the Council of the European Union from July onwards, with Viktor Orban at the helm. And he is a leader who obviously in recent years has weaponized his veto power at the heart of EU decision-making. And he's also been criticised in recent years for undermining rule of law in his own country and widespread human rights violations. And these elections are also taking place, as we've already mentioned, against a clear surge in far-right parties across Europe, particularly notable in countries such as the Netherlands, Austria, Germany, France, and Ireland. We know ourselves is also not immune. We saw what happened a few months ago in the riots in Dublin, and other things that are happening around the country. Far-right protests against migrants and on other issues. So it's really important, like we're trying to set the scene about how important these elections really are, and that how everyone's individual vote is significant, and especially probably more so than ever before, given this unstable and difficult geopolitical climate that we're living in. And really, ultimately, it's the voters who will decide which leaders will navigate the 21st century global system. Oh yeah, there's our nice Super Bowl picture. So yeah, let's talk a bit more about why the European elections are important. As we've explained, it's one of the biggest democratic votes in the world. Citizens who vote will define how the European Parliament will decide on key issues such as the economy, climate, migration, and so on. It's your opportunity, really. This is a vehicle to make your voice heard, because MEPs represent you. They represent you in Brussels and in Strasbourg. And if you want to be able to influence or have voice in the decision-making and policy-making processes at EU level, this is how you do it, basically. It really does, as we've said, the EU does impact your lives, your current situation and your future, and we'll talk to that a bit more now. And it is a form of democracy in action. And really, you know, as part of our role, European Movement Ireland, we really want to see informed and engaged citizens who feel that there is a space for them to engage, and the elections are part of this. So as I said, the elections are really important. We think they're going to happen around the 7th of June. And this is just a bit of an overview of kind of key dates around the elections we can see here. And yeah, some other issues around the elections. So as I said, 6th to 9th of June, with Ireland likely being the 7th of June. Our elections are likely to be the same day as local elections. Well, there's no legal obligation to vote in Ireland, but if you do want to vote, it's important that you're registered at least 15 days before polling day. So make sure you check the register. Irish and other EU citizens resident in Ireland are able to vote. And any other, yeah, you can see some of the key information here. We have 3 constituencies in total: Midlands, Northwest, South, and Dublin. And yeah, so we'll talk about this a bit more now. So who are the 2024 candidates? So we don't officially know yet. It's likely some will go run again, some of the current MEPs. Yeah, as we can see, 11 of the 13 sitting MEPs have confirmed or hinted their intention to run again, while 2 MEPs have confirmed that they are not contesting. And some Sinn Féin, Green Party and Fianna Fáil candidates have been confirmed. So here are some of the potential options. We won't go through all the names now, and we can share the presentation afterwards. But yeah, if you want to consult, you can see who are the likely or some of the likely candidates. And then let's talk a little bit about how the EU affects us at national level or in Ireland. So EU legislation in the form of its regulations and directives has significant effect on Irish law, and therefore are essentially our day-to-day lives. And Ireland obviously plays a key role in designing these policies and implementing them through both the MEPs and ministers in the council. So some of the key kind of areas that are relevant to us, the biggest one is probably the single market, which many consider one of the EU's greatest achievements. It has allowed us to have free movement of goods, services, money, and people. So it's, you know, a really important achievement for the bloc. Another interesting area is gender equality. And in fact, when Ireland wanted to join the EU, was forced to change its legislation around equal pay, or at the time unequal pay for men and women. So the EU, in that instance, pushed Ireland to reform its legislation so there would be equal pay. That's just one example, but it's really important how, in general, legislation or the kind of directives coming from the EU push member states to make sure that their legislation is more compliant with rule of law and with human rights and democratic principles. Also, we have to align ourselves with policy making around the climate change and the environment. the EU has played a really important role in recent years in crisis response. We've seen in terms of coordination around the COVID-19 pandemic, its response to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and so on. And I think for Ireland as a small member state, it has really given Ireland a greater platform on foreign policy affairs, for example, and Ireland probably has been able to raise its voice many times. We've seen during the Brexit negotiations, for example, Ireland played a crucial role on that, but also more recently on Gaza and Israel, Ireland has been one of the leading voices along with some other member states really pushing for a human rights compliant response from the EU and a ceasefire. And yeah, some of the major campaign issues, which we probably already touched upon, but we think these will obviously still be very pertinent to voters across the region and also in Ireland. The ongoing two-year anniversary the other day of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and not only the current conflict, but what happens in the future in terms of rebuilding Ukraine, reparation, and so on, how Ukraine can be supported, the current hostilities and conflict in Gaza, migration. The issue of migration is going to be very important, and unfortunately will probably be weaponized by some of the far-right groups. Enlargement, particularly in relation to the Western Balkan states, is of interest to many citizens. And then for younger people, or for people in general, climate change, the Green Deal, and digital transition is also an area of particular interest. Some of the major campaign challenges that we at European Movement Ireland have seen are disinformation and misinformation, and this can be linked to the far right. It's particularly prevalent on social media, online, and it's a really important issue to flag. We ourselves do quite a lot of work on it. We've research reports where we've examined kind of key narratives linked to disinformation on social media channels. So we have those on our website and we can share those with you afterwards. But also for yourselves, if you're online and you see statements that you think mightn't be accurate or fair, there's these different resources that you can see to the right of this slide, like Beam Media Smart, where you can check things. You can also come to us if you have any questions. So it's really important to be aware when you're online, when you're hearing opinions from friends, contacts, other people, maybe that are quite negative or racist or have different undertones, that you question, where is that information coming from? Like, is that actually a fact? But it is definitely a growing risk, and it's very difficult to counter. And there's obviously the additions of AI and other bots and how they then, those systems manipulate discourse online as well. Another key challenge is lack of interest, awareness on the EU, how the EU impacts us and how we can engage in it. And then youth participation, youth voting historically has been quite low. So it's really ourselves and other civil society organizations are really kind of obliged to engage with young people and to ensure that information is accessible, available, and is communicated in a way that's relevant to young people. So I think we've nearly done now, so thanks for all your patience. But some of the other key challenges are satisfaction with democracy is quite low, according to the Ipsos poll in 2023. However, support for democratic principles remains very strong. And in all studies, all countries studied, more people than not say they can influence things by voting in elections. So they still believe that elections are important. So yeah, thank you all for listening to us. We're coming to the end of our presentation, but just really we'd like to reiterate our key message, which is to engage in these elections, to take part, to vote, to make sure you're registered, and to engage in these broader issues, because they do relate to you, they relate to us, both as individuals and within our communities. And we're happy to take any questions and also to share any information. We've lots of information on our website, on our social media channels. And yeah, thanks for listening to us today.
Thank you so much, Lorna, and Aine for the comprehensive presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have a few questions submitted in advance, but to anyone in the audience, we welcome you to submit any questions you have through the chat function in the webinar. So we have a question here. So why should young people vote for the first time, take an interest in these elections and in the EU in general?
Do you want to start, Anya?
Hi. So I think it's a very good question, to be honest. I'm also a young person. I would count myself as a young person, and I talk a lot about this with my friends. I was discussing with it about it with Lorna as well. It is difficult to engage young people on these issues, especially because I think there is a lot of disenfranchisement, even going on social media. It's quite unsettling, and yeah, you can really feel like there's nothing that you can do. But I would really urge young people to connect the things that they care about. So, for example, right now we're seeing a lot of young people who are involved in the protests for Palestine and against what's going on in Gaza. And I would urge people to connect those kind of issues as well with elections, engage with MEPs that are supporting the same views that you support, and ask them questions. Really reach out to them, email them, go to events that they organize, and see if there are people that have put themselves forward as candidates that might align with your principles and align with what you want, because you'll find then these people go and represent you on the EU level. They play a very important role in legislating. So this is technical and maybe not as interesting for other people, but they are the processes that are very important to your life. There are things like sanctioning Russia, for example. There are things like calling for a ceasefire. And if you voted for an MEP that might not represent your views, of course, it can be quite disenfranchising. So now there's really an opportunity to dig a bit deeper and see if there are people out there that represent you. I would urge people not to abstain, because I don't think that will further any causes. And of course, protesting and going out, it does help. But I think, yeah, if you're annoyed about things, that you should reach out to MEPs and engage a bit more rather than abstaining. But obviously, I understand that there is a disenfranchisement. I'm on social media myself. It's not an easy place to be. But yeah, it's a crucial election, and these people do legislate and have power. So I think you owe it to yourself as a citizen and as a young person. These people will decide for the next 5 years things that are quite crucial. So yeah, that would be my call to action.
Oh, great. Thank you, Anya. I'm feeling very inspired now after your comment. Just have a question in the chat. With the rise of misinformation, how is the European Movement Ireland working to combat this in relation to the upcoming elections? And as voters, what can the rest of us do to help?
Thanks a lot. That's a great question. So we actually have an ongoing research and analysis project on this very topic. We're hopefully launching a second report later this week or early next week. So what we do is, it's some of my colleagues lead on this. They look at different social media channels, and they have different data systems where they use AI really or machine learning to assess kind of key groupings of language or narratives that keep coming up. And then they look at the wording, and then they, based on that and looking at other kind of secondary research, they're pulling out key patterns basically that they see, and they look at a period of time. So it could be on Reddit or a different key kind of social media channel in the Irish context. And then they're assessing that for misinformation, disinformation, producing really interesting analysis then where they kind of contrast the key messaging or disinformation messaging against the reality or kind of facts, basically. So it's really useful. They're really short, accessible pieces. They're sharing that then there's lots of, there's actually a very strong ecosystem in Ireland of civil society organizations working on disinformation. So we're by no means the only one. So they share these findings with their allies within different civil society spaces. Also, the Irish government is particularly interested, sharing with them as well. And we also share it with tech companies who are particularly interested in seeing what our findings are, because obviously they play a key role in monitoring, supervising, and trying to address kind of growing disinformation on their own channels. So yeah, that's what we're doing, but we're happy to share more on that, and hopefully you will take a look at our reports on our website as well.
Great. Oh, great. Thank you, Lorna. I just have one more question here. Just in relation to, so what is your opinion? What has been the biggest achievement of the sitting European Parliament, both for Ireland and the EU as a whole? Because sometimes talking to people, they feel that, you know, the EU is over there and feeling very removed. Can you give some examples, say, in Ireland, where we have, where there has been major achievements, say, outside of gender equality for women?
Yeah, I mean, I can start and talk maybe more broadly. I think in the sitting Parliament has faced probably unprecedented crises, maybe not unprecedented, but certainly a range of them in this current term. And if you look at how the EU as a whole responded to COVID, displayed a lot of leadership on that and trying to kind of join responses across the bloc. And obviously Ireland would have benefited from that. The Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what's happened there. That's also been a key, I think, response by the EU, and ongoing support and commitment to Ukraine and civilians in Ukraine who have, you know, had to deal with 2 years of horrific violations, forced displacement, and so on. That's another example, I think, an important role that the EU has played. And I think for Ireland more generally, as I said, it really gives Ireland the chance to punch it above its weight because it's a small member state. But I think Ireland has been outspoken on key issues in these spaces. Yeah, I don't know, Aine, if you've anything to add to that question.
I just unmute myself quickly. Yep, I think you can go as broad and as detailed as you want. In terms of, yeah, more specific examples for Ireland, ones that come to mind. I was talking about it with some of our colleagues in EMI about the common charger. So a lot of people have iPhones and Androids, and everyone had different chargers. And kind of in terms of consumer protection, I think a common charger is a very tangible one that people can, that will be something that everyone will be using now. That's all to do with EU legislation. It'll be illegal for phones to have different types of chargers. So that's very much an environmental win as well, as a practical win, I think, for consumers in Ireland. And yeah, I think also in terms of other climate change areas, today you'll see in the news the nature restoration law was passed that will go into Irish law as well, despite all of the protests going on. So that was quite a big achievement because there was a big pushback from the right and the far right on that kind of legislation. And in terms of COVID, there was the digital COVID certificate that was very much pushed through by the European Parliament, working in tandem with the Council. That was a big achievement because normally regulation in the EU takes a very long time to go through, and we saw that went through in record time. And was very useful. Everyone who was traveling during that time will definitely know if they used it. In terms of other achievements, I would say, yeah, other things are a good example are also to do with migration. There's the Migration and Asylum Pact has been provisionally agreed by the Parliament. That's quite a big achievement. And Frontex, which was a big refugee agency, the Parliament were the institution that were very much pushing for scrutinising that agency in terms of pushback of refugees. And yeah, the Conference on the Future of Europe is also a big win for citizens, I would say, bringing citizens more to the EU level. And that was started during this mandate, so in 2021. And yeah, I think you could go on and on smaller details. I know Aine spoke about gender equality. There was the Gender Violence Directive that was passed about a month ago now. So now there'll be EU-wide rules that will strengthen support and protection for victims of domestic violence. So that's definitely a win, although Ireland does have very strong views and strong legislation already. It definitely helps spread a standard across the EU. Yeah, AI is another big one. If people are interested in AI, the AI Act was agreed recently, although it still has to be formally adopted. And if you're interested in that, you can see the kind of amendments that the Parliament put through, and they would be they're very strong in terms of protecting citizens and data protection. So yeah, I think we could go on, but if you're interested, there are web pages and stuff on the European Parliament's website looking at kind of the legislative term, and you can go through, click through different kind of themes and see a bit more in detail what has actually happened. I do think that the EU has work to do on communicating successes. So yeah, those are some examples that are a bit more concrete but specific.
Great, thank you, Anya. That seems to be all the questions I have. Laura, would you like to ask a question of our guest speakers?
I will do. What are your thoughts on reducing the voting age to 16?
I might let you go first, Anya, as I think you're closer to 16 than I am, just by a little bit.
I would personally agree with it. EMI doesn't necessarily have a line on that, but I do think that it's not a bad idea. Germany now, we had the German climate minister, Anna Lerman, she's Minister for Climate and EU Affairs. She was in for a podcast a couple of weeks ago. You can listen to it on our website. And Germany have just lowered the voting age to 16. Belgium also, you can vote at 16. Greece, I think it's 17. So there are, I think, about 5 EU countries, I think, that you can vote under 18, not for general elections, but definitely for the EU elections. And the reasons really are because these issues, they affect so many. They affect, of course, every demographic, but they're even more important for young people because by the time the end of the mandate comes in 2029, those citizens will be 3 years over the voting age. So at the moment, so I do think that lowering the voting age can help and also could shift the politics a little bit more towards more liberal policy and more centre-left policy. As we've seen, kind of the trends of younger people tend to vote for more green policies, etc. So yeah, I do think it could be a positive thing. I didn't see that much of an appetite though for the moment, lowering the voting age obviously for this vote, but who knows, in 5 years we could follow the steps of Germany and Belgium.
Thank you. That is great. Yeah, it's really important to get people really invested in their own future and to take ownership of the decision making and how they can implement that decision making and work with the power structures we have. I think that looks like that's all the questions that we have. So we'll wrap up. A massive thank you to Lorna, Anya. It's much appreciated. And behind the scenes, we have Pina and Leonore also helping us. You can't see them. But a massive thank you to our attendees as well. If you have any questions or you want to email any follow-ups, you can send it to anya.daly@concern.net. We'll have another session in a couple of weeks, and it'll feature speakers from STG Watch Europe, Barry Andrews MEP, and we'll have some Concern colleagues from our Bangladesh team discussing the EU as a humanitarian actor and discussing how the EU funds concerns work. So thank you very much, and please stay in touch and look out on social media for the next session. Thank you.